In this presentation, I want to talk about, to give a summary of chapter 2 of Abu Lughod's famous ethnography, Veiled Sentiments. I'm doing this because I'm interested in the symbolic dimensions of blood as it is understood amongst the Awlad Ali Bedouins. So this presentation, of course, follows on from my previous presentation, which looked at the first chapter entitled Guest and Daughter. The title of this chapter is Identity in Relationship. And the point is that the reason why we have the title Identity in Relationship is anthropologists looking at relationships, and particularly relationships of kin, have tended to focus on the relationship as a principle for social organisation and social structure. By contrast, Abu Lughod is interested in relationships, and particularly kin relationships, as providing identity. In other words, in order to answer the question who I am, I define who I am in terms of my relationships with kin, with family that is, and with others. So she begins the chapter on page 39 describing her romantic preconceptions of the field. She imagined tents along a white sand beach, the turquoise Mediterranean glimmering in the background. The reality for her was a bit different, of course. She found that the people no longer were following camels around in the desert. They were no longer nomadic. They lived in houses and drove cars. They did miss the desert, and they did particularly like the food of the desert, what they called the dry food, delicacies of the desert, which they preferred to the fruits and vegetables that they grow near the Mediterranean. But in spite of all that, it wasn't so much the desert that defined them, but the social space. Their sense of space was social. Quote, theirs is an intensely social world in which people's activities and relationships are riveting, and solitude so abhorred that no one sleeps alone. Put another way, another quote, long one here. The Bedouins define themselves not primarily by a way of life, however much they value pastoral nomadism and the rigours of the desert, but by some key principles of social organisation, genealogy, and a tribal order based on the closeness of agnates, that is, paternal relatives, and tied to a code of morality, that of honour and modesty. Their social universe is ordered by these ideological principles, which define individuals' identities and the quality of their relationships to others. These principles are gathered up in Awlad Ali notions of blood, a multifaceted concept with dense meanings and tremendous cultural force, two aspects of which will be explored below. So, to put it in other terms, their idea of what blood is tied up with their notions of relationships with others, of the morality, a code of morality of honesty and modesty, and the closeness of your paternal relatives you get from your father's side, and the importance of genealogy and tribal order. It's all tied up in symbolic ideas of blood. Now there are two words for blood. One is asl, which is the blood that links you to your ancestors, both living and dead. By way of background, Abu Lughod explains that the Awlad Ali Bedouins were derived from 11th century Arab invaders. They may have to Egypt in the late 16th or 17th century, and then lived in the Western Desert, but were marginal to the agricultural and irrigated society along the Nile. So they depended on rainfall, not irrigation, for pasture for their camels. They were also engaged in literal trade and maintained contact with Europeans, Libyans, Egyptians. Not just trade, but also smuggling, invasions, and so on. Throughout all this, Abu Lughod says, the Bedouins maintained a separate identity. And although Muhammad Ali and the British tried to control the Awlad Ali, and Nasser tried to assimilate them in the post-colonial era, they have maintained a separate identity. And this is the case even though they have settled down, been converted to farmers, converted to farming, and have access to Western education and medicine. So they still maintain, in spite of all that, their separate identity, particularly in opposition to other non-Bedouins, peasants, Egyptians, people from Cairo, and Christians, who they hold in a sort of contempt. So their interest really is only in tribal affairs, and they aren't interested in the outside world or even Egyptian culture. They think of themselves as being descended from Arabs. They are Arabs, not Egyptians, and this is the asl, this blood of the ancestors. Those ancestors were the pure Arab tribes who were the first followers of the Prophet Muhammad. Quote from page 44. So this Arab blood gives them nobility. This is the asl blood. It is the authenticator of origin and pedigree. They have this asl blood. The Egyptians, who are impure and weak, lack that asl blood. Because these Egyptians, they're basically inferior slaves, and they lack the Bedouin qualities of the honor code as far as the Bedouins are concerned. So an Awlad Ali man will say, I'm a man of my word, honest, generous, fearless, and brave, unlike the soft Egyptian cowards. And those Egyptian men are weak, and the women are immodest. They're so immodest, those women, they have sex on the first night of marriage. And they're so weak, the husbands and wives love each other in public, show affection. They even have pet names like Honey and Love and Dear for each other. And that's because they lack the honor, they lack the strength, they lack the fearlessness of the Bedouins, basically because they lack the asl blood. The other kind of blood that Abu Lughod describes from page 49 is, I'm sure my pronunciation will be even worse this time, Garaba. I'll call it Garaba, which is the blood of relationship. It is a means of determining social place and links between people. That's what Garaba is. So moving on to page 50. This is here where she advances her idea that kinship is as much about identity as it is politics. She also adds that it's about feelings towards, quotes, persons in their social world. To digress for a second, I find this a little bit circular because she's saying kinship is about people in their social world, and she's defining kinship as feelings about people in their own social world, as I said, but I don't think she gets, doesn't really give us anything new there. That's kind of what we assumed. Okay, I didn't explain my argument very well, and I'll leave it. It's not really important what I think. I'm just trying to summarize her thoughts. So basically, an Awlad Ali person will tell you, we live in tribes linked to a common grandfather. So the Awlad Ali themselves are divided into separate tribes, and they identify these tribes in terms of a common, of a grandfather. So there'd be, like in my case, a Herriman tribe, and then there's also maybe a Smith tribe, and so on, and a Jones tribe. And if somebody asks me, where are you from, I'll respond by identifying a homeland that my tribe comes from. But I'll try to answer it in such a way that will establish a bond with the person who's asking me. So I might talk about the larger homeland or a more specific homeland in order to accommodate the person and make them feel like they're at one with me. To make a silly analogy, if I'm overseas and somebody asks me where you're from, and I think they're Australian, I'll say I'm from Australia. But if I think they're from Western Australia, where I'm from, I'll say I'm from Western Australia. That will make us seem even closer, but I'll look for a common bond. Okay? And here she then moves on that it's not about, kinship is not about providing political relationships, it's about shaping an individual identity. Oh no, it's not that it's not about political relationships, that's just one aspect that other anthropologists have followed. What Abu Lughod wants to describe is how it shapes individual identity. And this all comes down to blood, because it's the blood that you share through a common grandfather that gives you your tribal identity. So it's a shared substance that all the people that come from my paternal grandfather have. All the men that are descended from my paternal grandfather have. And anybody who has that blood, I feel close to. And if you're finding this a bit confusing, I would direct you to my presentation on Bedouin kinship. But the basic idea is, it might help you if you're from Australia, for example, thinking about, or America or England, where they still practice a kind of patrilineal naming, which means, for example, your name is Smith, your father's name is Smith, your sister's name is Smith until she marries, and then she loses that name because she marries Jones, and then the children become Jones too. So your sister's husband and their children do not belong to your patriline. Your sister remains in your patriline. Your father, of course, remains is part of your patriline, and so your mother doesn't belong to your patriline. So it works a bit like surnames, if you neglect the fact that we change our names after we marry in European contexts. If that's still confusing, just check out this video I made. Okay, moving on. So I share this blood, this garab, with, sorry, is that what it is? Garaba, with my patriline, other people in my patriline, my paternal relatives. And that makes me feel close to those people. So, quotes, the Bedouin vision of social relations is dominated by this ideology of natural, positive, and unbreakable bonds of blood between consanguines, that is people who share the same blood, particularly agnates, that is people who link to the patriline, including putative or distant agnates. So, okay, I could, if I look at my father's brother's son's son, which I think is my third or fourth cousin in Australian context, for a Bedouin, he's still part of the patriline, and and for the Bedouins, there's this unbreakable bond you have with that person. In Australia, we don't consider that bond particularly important, but in Bedouin context, because he's part of that person is part of your. I'm just going to close the door because my kids are making too much noise. That person is part of your patriline, so that you're much closer to them. So this principle of agnation, that is patrilineal blood, takes priority as far as they're concerned. another way to put it is that the children basically belong to the father, not the mother. Quotes, children take their father's tribal affiliation, from page 53. In case of divorce, the mother has no right to keep the children. Another quote, paternal kin have dual rights to all children born to wives of agnates. What that means is the child naturally wants to live with his father's family. A nice story here. A woman divorced by her husband after he had brought her to her natal home for a visit never returned for her. Her young son, considered too young to part from his mother, was with her. After a year, the boy's paternal grandfather came to the house to take his grandson back. According to reports, he asked his 5-year-old grandson, "Would you like to come with me?" Although the boy had never seen him before, he ran to pack a few clothes, he put his hand in his grandfather's, and left with hardly a glance back. His mother was heartbroken. The men who heard the story nodded their heads and did not seem surprised. Blood was all they said by way of explanation. Garaba. So the point here is that a woman also maintains her tribal affiliation even at the expense of her children. Oh my goodness, this door keeps on opening. Even at the expense of her children. So I mentioned before that in Western cultures, after you marry, you change your surname, or used to typically, which kind of indicates that you join with your husband. But that's not the case amongst the Bedouins. You remain part of your father's clan, your father's tribe. The implication of this is, if there's a problem in the marriage, you can run back to your father's tribe. Or if a wife has a problem with a husband, it is the right and the duty of her brother and father to get involved. The expression is she has men behind her. She says, if somebody insults her, if somebody in her husband's tribe insults her, so you insult me, don't forget I've got men behind me. But also these men who are behind her, that is her brothers and her father, are also responsible for punishing her. And I think what Abu Lughod is getting at there is honour killings and so on. But that comes later in the book, I imagine. So this agnation, though, is not just a strategic bond. It's not just something you use to fight back when somebody's in your husband's tribal group is attacking you or insulting you. It's something you feel very strongly. You want to join in visits when there's a visit back to your father's tribe, you want to visit it. You want to join those visits. And now is perhaps the right time to mention, I should have mentioned 10 minutes ago, that marriage is patrilocal. What that means is that after you get married, the couple move to live with the husband's people. That's patrilocal marriage. So this is what can be quite difficult for a wife in these circumstances. She doesn't belong. She's always an outsider after she marries. And to the extent that her children belong to the father's tribe and she doesn't. So even her children are, in a sense, even though there's an extremely close bond between mother and child, in a legal sense, that they're not hers. They belong to the husband. And it's not an affectionate bond, husband and wife, unlike those contemptuous Egyptians who are always being so affectionate with their wives. even sleeping together when they go visiting other people. The Bedouins believe you must not let your affection for your wife show. So far we've been discussing the problems of being a wife in relation to the garaba idea of blood. Because the wife doesn't share your garaba, she is an outsider and she doesn't have any right over your children. If you divorce her, she goes back by herself to her brothers and fathers' people. If you have a problem with your wife, or a problem with my wife, her husband, her brother and father will come and talk to me. Now, so it's not a particularly wonderful situation, you might say, from an outsider's perspective. However, there is one form of marriage that can escape these problems, and that is marrying your cousin. But not just any cousin, you can only marry one kind of cousin. You can't marry anybody on your mother's side. That doesn't help at all. Because anybody on your mother's side is typically not going to have your garaba. But you can marry people with your own garaba. You can't marry your sister or your mother, of course, because these are what they're called. Can't remember the word, but anyway, that is thought of as incestuous. But you can marry people on your father's side. And not anybody on your father's side. You can't marry your father's sister's child, your cousin through that way, because, now just say you're a woman now, oh no, just say you're a man. You're a man, you cannot marry your father's sister's daughter because your father's sister married somebody who does not have your garaba. She married somebody from another tribe, so the child does not have your garaba, your blood. Anthropologists would call that cousin a cross cousin. You can't marry a cross cousin, but you can marry your parallel cousin, and that is your father's brother's daughter, your father's brother's daughter. Now she's the perfect match because she's distant enough for it not to be incestuous under Bedouin conceptions, but she's close enough that she shares the garaba. So these are great people to marry because if there's any problem, if there's a divorce or something, the kids stay in the tribe, the wife stays with her own people, because even though it's patrilocal, she belongs to that patrilineal tribe, so she's fine. Now, so it seems to solve a lot of problems. And Abu Lughod then asks, how is it different? So she asks, one of the, I'm laughing because for me as an Australian, it's quite, how shall I say, challenging. Okay. One man said to her, marrying a cousin is like marrying a sister. You won't feel like talking or flirting. And she knows everything about you, where you go and who you see. So it's probably not as sexy as marrying somebody from another tribe. But it builds on paternal kinship. This wife is paternal kin and takes precedence over non-paternal kin wives. What that means is that even if she's my third or fourth wife, got a message. I want to go to the, okay, I've got permission to go to the shops. Away you go. So what that means is, even though it could be my third or fourth wife, she'll take precedence over the other wives because she's amongst her people. So wives 1, 2, and 3 just have to realise that they are now subordinate to this new wife. And I like her because I know, because she's part of my people, I know she'll take care of the house, and she'll even care for the children of my other wives, because they're her people too. My other wives belong to other people, belong to other tribes. They won't take care of the house when I go. They don't care about me. They care about their own tribes. They care about their own garaba, their own blood. And in fact, some of my children, to my co-wives, may be more connected to this new wife of mine from my own tribe, my father's brother's daughter. Nearly all the young children born to his other wives slept with this parallel cousin wife, ate with her, and spent more time with her than with their own mothers. This is one example. Women like marrying in these circumstances because they, quotes, remain among those whose duty it is to protect them. They are not as dependent on their husbands. They also feel comfortable in the community. And given that relations between unrelated members of the opposite sex are highly circumscribed and even distant or hostile, quoting page 58, this seems to be a solution. So the poor old wives 1, 2, and 3 who do not share my garaba, who belong to other tribes who have different garaba, that is to say, they'll need to form alliances amongst themselves to try and maintain some power. Now, even though what I've been discussing here now is agnation, that is ties of blood within the patriline, it's not the exclusive form of kinship. And in another presentation, if I get around to it, I'll discuss maternal ties and a common life, which begins in page 59 of my book. Alright, so that's chapter 2 up to page 59 of Veiled Sentiments, and the two ideas of blood, asl and garaba.